Thank you. Well, I'm not Marcel, I'm Andrew EdgeCliffe-Johnson.
No, I was going to say you're not already.
I'm the media editor for the Financial Times, and having seen those slides about newspaper publishing, I'm very grateful to be still invited to do things like this. So we're sitting here in the Paley Centre, in the epicenter of the entertainment and media world. You could throw a stone and hit CBS, NBC, Time Inc., News Corp, even the FT block away. Is that game coming to an end when you look at that sort of international picture you've described of much faster growth from every other market almost, with the exception of a few ignoble Western European ones? The major growth is coming from a long way away.
Look, the major, Andrew, number one, I'm not sure whether we're throwing stones at all. But in terms of where the growth is coming from, I mean, the stats have been really saying the same thing for a while now. The question is how aware, what are people doing about that growth opportunity? But I do want to pick up on something I think either Sean or Deborah said. You cannot ignore those mature markets. So, I'm an evangelist when it comes to talking about what happens around the world. So, you can get me going on that. But you cannot ignore the mature markets at this point. Why? Because a 1% change in a mature market, if you just work the numbers through in terms of total dollars, actually has a much bigger impact than maybe a 15% change in one of those up-and-comers, right? And often that 1% can actually begin to fall down to the bottom line much quicker than building an infrastructure in a developing market.
That's a very comforting message, but if you carry that to its logical extreme, then you would never spend much time in Indonesia or the Philippines.
Well, as someone who spends
Argentina,
a lot of time in Indonesia and all of those markets, I think what I was trying to do there is just put it into context, right? Because I think to play one end of this story, one side of the story, only is wrong. So let's talk about the growth markets. I'm very happy to talk about the growth markets. I think that one of the reasons why I like talking about those markets is because I think there's a great deal to learn as well. So there's this huge, ultimately we are now globalized in terms of not just the world economy, but certainly in terms of media. And consumers are behaving remarkably the same around the world. And I think one of the things that, as we start talking about the democratization of access, the haves of 5 years ago were much fewer than they are now. Well, let me define
the haves.
And more
geographically concentrated.
Absolutely. So now the haves, and if I define the haves as those people, those consumers who have, internet access, be it fixed or mobile, and have some sort of smart device, those are the haves. 5 years ago, 3 years ago, it was very concentrated and very small. By 5 years' time, the haves, there's an awful lot of them. And by the way, many of them are now middle class. 2/3 of the world will be middle class by 2030. And middle class consumers, as they reach that stage, historically have been huge spenders on, a lot of their initial discretionary spend goes on media and entertainment. In India, and going back to your sector, at the moment there are whole swathes of the country who share newspapers. The first aspirational thing to do is to read a newspaper.
It's very heartening.
Right, that is the first thing. And the second thing is to read 3 newspapers, right? So, you can see these dynamics that are building around the world.
So I would guess that many of the people in this room, and certainly many of the people in the buildings around us, are still heavily skewed to those mature markets. It has been a very successful export model for media and entertainment from this country, but it has been an export model. It's mostly been you produce it here or in LA, and you plant your flag in other markets, but you're sort of shipping. Do you, as you look at the growth from those next wave countries and others, do you think it's going to be captured by the people in this neighborhood or by their domestic companies?
Yeah, so media traditionally has been local, right? It's either by regulation or just by language, right? Media is local. That's why we, and actually I've heard it less recently, but obviously that term globalization, right? But I'm a big believer.
I would never get through the FT style guide for what it's worth, but yeah.
I could talk about re-glocal. That was my new one. Anyway,
okay.
It's okay. No one's listening yet, Andrew. It's fine.
If anyone's a fan of Lucy Kellaway, I'm sending that one to her today. But okay, re-glocal. What is re-glocal?
It's the combination between regional and local, but I'll come back to it later. So he's
learned something this
distracting
morning
me.
already. Okay.
But I think if we go back to the premise that media and entertainment is largely a local experience, it's local language and their local dynamics. That's where it starts off. So I think that the challenge is always for what I would call the international media companies is how to appeal to that local audience. And increasingly, we're seeing a lot more co-production activity than we have seen before. And obviously, we're seeing a lot more M&A, partnering, that type of thing going on. Because the thing that we should also just consider at this point is the shifting of populations. So if you look at the Indian diaspora, the Chinese diaspora, right? And you look at how these populations are moving across the world, the Latino shift, that we also have to just take into account these dynamics when we're looking at who wins, who takes share of what. And of course, within all of that context, and it's something that maybe one talks a little bit less about here, but certainly I know is a huge issue, is the position of regulators. Because generally speaking, regulators regulate for yesterday and today, not for tomorrow. That's a sweeping statement, but certainly across the world, that is generally true. And what's happening is we have this huge pace of change, which is really difficult for regulators to react to in a fast enough way. And I think that's a huge frustration for media companies around here. As they go into markets, regulators often are there not necessarily to assist in that process. So consumers getting there, but regulators aren't.
So even in the markets that are relatively open from a regulatory point of view, you're talking about this narrowing of the gap in access, between haves and have-nots.
Yeah.
And the sense I get is, there is suddenly this global market for content that was once local, and smartphones and other tablets and other connected devices enable that. But clearly the economics of these markets are radically different. To use your Indian newspaper analogy, you're not going to be spending, not many people are going to be spending hundreds of dollars a year on a subscription to the Financial Times. They'll be spending a few rupees a day to the local city or national paper. So do you see that sort of any sort of pricing, sort of evening out of the pricing around the world, or do media companies going to have to live with radically different pricing for those markets, even as the content becomes more similar?
Well, pricing is obviously a local issue and what the market can bear. But I think in general terms that where this becomes a lot more confusing is this combination of pricing and availability. Because as I go around the world, and I was actually interviewed by someone yesterday in Hong Kong, and this particular journalist had been amazingly frustrated. In fact, she was having a go at me, and it's not nothing to do with me. Because she was trying to find a certain show, right? A TV show, and she'd heard about it, and she wanted to go and find it, and she was willing to pay, right? A journalist willing to pay? That's, sorry.
You can see Asian markets are different, okay.
And her frustration was she couldn't find it, right? Or when she eventually found what she wanted, and guess what? It wasn't available locally, legally, right? And she was willing to pay. I don't think she didn't finish the sentence, because obviously, but I think you can imagine the rest of that sentence.
So simply making your content available is part of the battle?
I honestly believe, as I go around the world, it is, and it's the most common complaint I get from consumers in whichever market, that it's great now having social networks, but social networks means we're all connected, right? So if you see something and you think it's pretty cool, you tell me and I can't see it.
So the sort of the old model was very much you'd launch Game of Thrones in the US or Mad Men or something, and then you would wait a decent few months, and then you get around to sort of bring it to London, and then if you're lucky, Australia would be 6 months down the track, and then it might eventually filter through to India a year or two later. But these sort of very carefully thought through windows for syndication and for other models. Piracy is what you're sort of implicitly touching on here, but is that windowing system for content just shattered now?
I'm not sure I would go as far as to say it's shattered. It's certainly, those windows are narrowing anyway, right? I mean, there's been a huge decrease in those windows. Those windows are still important. Rights are still important. But the problem is, we understand that if we're in the industry because that's what we think.
But the
consumer doesn't get it. And so I think that what we are seeing is because this consumer, us, has all this choice. The other thing we're actually becoming, I think, is pretty confused about what's out there, because we'll hear something new virtually every day, and we are confused by the offerings that are available. So I think that, there was a study done recently in Singapore around, and it was talking to consumers again around how they access TV content. And what came back was, we don't even know what's legal and what's not. So we go online, and I think that it really represents, I think, a challenge for how the industry communicates to its consumers, who hopefully they're gaining more direct access to, around where their content can actually be found legally. Because inevitably, if you don't know, there is a chance you'll find it somewhere else that's illegal. And what this study found, actually, which was quite interesting, is the consumers were paying for it, but they were paying for it off an illegal source, right? So, blur, right? There's got to be something there So
when we were speaking a year ago, you pronounced in Churchillian fashion that it was the end of the digital beginning.
Yes, I was right.
So, right. How long's the digital middle going to be, and when do we get to the digital end? So, more seriously than that, that sounded a very positive message. But one of the things I noticed in the study, as I was looking through the numbers, is that consumer spending on digital content, even by 2017, is going to be pretty small. It's below 20%, if I remember rightly. So now you're talking about this great growth in digital advertising, but when you actually look at the issue of consumers paying for your content and that sort of balance model to dual revenue streams that everybody likes of consumer payment plus advertising, does that mean we're still at the digital dime stage?
Look, I think, and there's huge, I think there's huge definition, first of all, around what is digital actually. We tend to classify it as anything that's
CD-ROMs, right?
I think it's probably electronic, actually. Right. But anyway, first of all, there is a sort of definition of what is digital. But I think getting to the heart of your question, have we gone from digital dimes into sort of digital dollars? I think we need to also think about, as an answer to that, is what are we really selling, right? What are we really? So I think consumers increasingly buy experiences and they buy engagement. The good news is what lies at the heart of that is really cool content, and everyone is wanting to be in the content game, right? Telcos are trying to produce content. Everyone's trying to produce content. So the good news is content is absolutely critical. But it's interesting because I think consumers are increasingly paying for something that is content plus, right? It's around the convenience, it's around the experience, it's around all the things that we're now beginning to build around this sort of the basic content to make it an enhanced experience. Now, what that will mean is the nature of revenues that the industry takes may well be more to do with share of revenue. It may well be, and this is something that we're seeing a lot, is we're seeing other people entering the value chain who have a different perspective, but can offer something on top of the basic content. And so I think we're seeing this huge growth in partnerships. We're seeing this huge growth in other revenue streams, right? So, live music is growing very significantly over the forecast period and has over the last 2 to 3 years. To me, music is music. The ironical thing is that you pay $150 to go and see Lady Gaga, but the same people who are going are not paying for music, right? So I think that maybe it shouldn't necessarily just be the sort of, the digital cent comment. It should really be about what are the products and services that we are engaged in and delivering to consumers.
Looking much more in the round at the definition of the business. So it seems to me that most of my conversations with people in media at the moment are, when the minute you get onto digital, you shift immediately to mobile. And the sort of, the biggest problem people are trying to get their heads around at the moment is monetizing this apparently hugely promising revolution in access that you're talking about. If you look at the mobile advertising question, social advertising, etc., people haven't cracked it. Do you think we're going to crack this over the period you're talking about?
Well, I'm looking over at Carla because I'm sure she's probably going to give us her point of view a little bit later, and therefore I'll have to be a bit careful what I say.
Audience participation is allowed, if you like.
But she's going to get her chance. So look, what we're actually looking at is still at mobile advertising. So the growth in mobile advertising that we're forecasting over the next 5 years is basically a 27% compound growth rate, right? So that's not shabby. And if we can...
Off a pretty low base.
Off a pretty low base. And I was actually going to say, if we went back 3 to 4 years, there was only about $2 billion worth of mobile, right? It is interesting because it's not just the access. I do believe that we've been talking about mobile as the killer. I mean, Deborah and I have had this conversation for years. She kept telling me it's mobile, and I said, but it isn't there. And she was right, and I was right. And what happened 3 years ago is we suddenly started getting the smart device, and that has unleashed this power of mobility. Because finally, as a consumer, I am wanting to interact with a mobile device in preference to a fixed device. Sean got it dead right when he said, whatever that statistic used, about 77% searches, that's correct. 3 years ago, I believe mobile, the best term for mobile was it was a distressed device. When I couldn't get access on a big screen or whatever, I went to my mobile because I was in distress. I was on the underground system, right? And I was distressed. Actually, that's a bad example because the signals didn't go there in those days. But if I was in Hong Kong, I was on, their signals did. And when I couldn't do anything else, I went to my mobile because I was in distress. That's completely shifted now. It's the device of choice. And it's that, I think, has really opened up the opportunity for mobile. And so we will see strong growth in mobile revenues. I don't believe yet that we have fully understood the potential. And I think we have a lot to learn. Therefore, we do have to look around the world at how mobile is being used. Mobile in Africa, for example, has been used as a payment device for years, right? And I think, so that's why I think there's an awful lot that we have to learn, we have to experiment with as well.
I mean, it's had this very functional, very beneficial role, if you're a Kenyan farmer, for example, but can it make, is a Kenyan farmer also using it as an entertainment device? Is it making
Well, I tell you
what
he will start to do. He'll start using it as a payment method for entertainment content, right? A Kenyan farmer perhaps hasn't had the, that's not necessarily been his or her priority. It was probably just playing for grain, right? But the good thing is he has the payment device. So he or she has that payment device. And I think that is, we have to understand that consumers who come from, who are not encumbered by all the stuff that we in this room are, right? You and I are encumbered by our past, by our history. And I think the coolest thing is understanding the behaviors of people who come to this new. So those haves that are having it for the first time don't have that legacy. And that's why I think we need to look at those markets to understand, A, the behavior, and B, the potential for monetization.
So it's very tempting at these things to just think about the growth and the sort of the future. But all of these, all of the established players in these industries have enormous legacy businesses. Is it clear? Is there a sort of common thread running through the strategies they should be deploying for managing the legacy business? I mean, for example, anytime I sit down with a newspaper publisher or a magazine publisher, we can spend 100% of the time talking about digital without anybody bothering to ask, what's your print strategy? Is this the moment that people should be asking that question?
Well, I hope what's happening is people are asking, well, how will consumers interact with my content, and how will they pay for that content, right? And print, hard copy probably forms a part of that. I would say that and when we talk about legacy businesses and we talk about the approach, one is it's around insight, customer insight. The second, it's around agility and innovation. There's a huge amount of innovation that we have seen. Unfortunately, sometimes it's not either communicated in the right way to consumers such that it's not really fully appreciated. But I think the three watchwords for me is insight, agility, and innovation. And that needs to permeate through all of our organizations. And it also needs to, I think, embedded in that, unfortunately, is change. Designing content with a different mindset, designing it for a consumer who is mobile or digital, right? Sean alluded to it. Designing the way that we structure our organizations with that in mind. And of course, that involves people. It involves how people are paid, whether they're paid at all, right? And these become very, very difficult issues. These are not simple things, but I do believe that that's why when we see a company coming new, they're always able to crack it quicker.
I was once told the only thing that likes change is a wet baby, and you don't have many of those in most workplaces. But do you think though, now if we're past the end of the digital beginning, do you think that these companies have actually made the structural and cultural shifts that you're saying are necessary to become more agile, or how do you think they're going to get there? It's
a journey, right? We're on a journey. Some people are moving quicker than others. I think what's happening though is that disruption is really cool. I think there's nothing wrong with disruption, and I think it's how people react to that. It is a journey. There is obviously still a concern about, how do I protect a legacy? I think it's more how do you monetize that legacy in a different way. I think that we are seeing huge change. But I think that the issue is over the speed of change, but I am actually quite encouraged by the fact that in the last 18 months to 2 years, that pace of response has become much bigger. And that is because you've had players coming in there that are disrupting, and there's this oh my God moment, and oh my God is good for change, right?
All right. Now I'm going to open up for questions in just a minute, so please think of them and stick your hand up in a moment. Just sort of last question from me.
Yeah.
You talked about this rush for content. Talk to those Moonves across the street. He'll tell you he can sell hundreds of millions of dollars worth of I Love Lucy episodes. Seinfeld has racked up billions already. Netflix is writing very big checks. Hulu Plus, etc. It's a wonderful time to be running some of these companies. But you're also saying there is this explosion of content creation, be it from new large digital players or from user-generating content and all the stuff we know. So all content is not created equal here. What's actually going to be valuable in 5 years' time?
Well, I think number one is it's content that is delivered with this consumer in mind who is using and engaging with it, right? So we've seen the impact, for example, we talk a lot about companion second screens when it comes to, TV content. Yeah, for sure, right? Design of companion content. So I think the first thing is, it's not necessarily the type of content, but it's the way that content is envisaged to meet that audience, okay? There is no question that kick-ass content like sport, right, is really hugely important, hugely valuable, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. And I think on other types of content, it's really around this: is it made for me? And one of the things that we talk about in this year's Outlook is the sort of move from mass media to my media. As a consequence of that, I think we're going to be talking a lot also about curation of communities and the roles that content companies and others have in curating those communities. Because as new things are introduced, go back to my point around that journalist who couldn't find what she was looking for, right? Now there was an opportunity, actually, there is an opportunity there for her to be pulled in, such that when something is, released, whatever the right word is, she knows where it is, right? And so I think that we need to also think not just about content creation, content aggregation, and all those good things, but we need to talk about the curation of communities, because that will enable us to deal with this shift from mass media to my media, from one to many, to one to one, many to many. It has to involve that curation of that community. And what better way of doing it than around cool content?
All right. Now we've got some microphones, I think. So who has a question for Marcel? this is like a British audience. Okay, right.
That's because of us, mate.
I count
it's due
on
respect,
New Yorkers to be more forthcoming. Could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm James Orsini, CEO of Single Touch. You mentioned that you and Deborah had a debate 3 years ago and saw the mobile moving from a distressed device to a device of choice. And Sean went so far as to say creative agencies should possibly consider creating for mobile first. So where do you see this mobile now by 2017? If we looked in the rearview mirror over the last 3 years, and we're hearing some bold statements, where do you see this device by the end of this term?
So first of all, this device that we talk about, whether it's the first generation or whatever release of this device it is, this device, by which we mean a smart device, will be in many more hands than it is today. So that's a fact. And it doesn't really matter if it isn't the latest one, because even the basic functionality will enable a consumer to do what, right? I now agree with Deborah, right? I didn't agree with her 3 years ago because I didn't see it, because we didn't have the device. I'm with her now, and I think the shift, it is inevitable. But it doesn't, by the way, mean that, for example, the viewing experience. I think it's interesting. We had this shift, when Andrew and I grew up, right?
Not in the same house or
right.
at the same time.
We watched TV with our parents. It was kind of like that social experience, and then we
Jimmy
all
Savile mostly.
You as well.
No.
Damn. So that's probably true. It went from this sort of the social experience of a family, and then everyone went and had their own things in their own rooms, right? But I do believe that we're beginning to watch content more collectively, if not in the same room, right? And what is enabling that, I think, is the mobility fact. Is the fact that you don't have to be in one place to be able to network and to enjoy a social experience. It's because of that I think it's a real game changer. I also believe, and we have the statistics in the book to show it, which basically, because there are a large number of people who will never have ever experienced being tethered, right? I mean, look how stupid those, why was a telephone ever attached to the wall, for God's sake, right? And I mean, out there today, I mean, a lot of people who just can't get that. But why is the TV tethered to the wall? Why is, so I think that the reason why it becomes so compelling is because there will be people who never connect to a wall, who never connect to a physical building other than to charge the battery. And maybe the biggest problem with mobility right now is over battery life. And I know there was a girl that's come out with like a supercharging battery, but maybe the biggest problem is battery life, because everything else is really getting there.
Over here. Do you have the microphone? We'll go on to you.
I'll shout.
All right.
Duncan Edwards from Hurst. Just curious if you could expand a little bit on your comments about the role of regulators and as you see it in the future. Just interested in where you see the issues there, whether you see it's about sort of antitrust issues, preventing consolidation, privacy issues, or ownership rights for foreign companies. I mean, where do you see this whole kind of framework heading?
Okay, well, all those issues, I mean, I would think certainly all of those issues are the issues, and there are some more as well, particularly around censorship, dare I say it. Where do I see it heading? I mean, certainly I would say that regulators are beginning to understand, or at least, yes, beginning to understand the issue of a level playing field. I mean, that I think is a key aspect of what many people are talking about. They are distracted at the moment by the privacy one, right, which is taking on a huge life of its own. And by the way, the consumers that we talk to are talking about it a lot, so you can understand why the regulators are interested in that. That needs to be dealt with. The degree to which regulators are learning from each other is increasing, but unfortunately with media, I'm going to make maybe a controversial statement, is that media owners in many parts of the world own other things other than media, right? They're very, very influential in their own marketplaces, right? And so inevitably it's not as simple as just saying blame the regulator, right? because the regulator's job is to regulate. This is to do with policy, it's to do with influence, and and that is why it's a lot more complicated than just saying regulators talking to each other, because they do that actually quite well. But their job is I think, more complicated because this is a policy issue, this is a political issue, and if you look at the interests in media in many countries, you know, it's not just about media, it's about other things as well. So I'm not sure, I didn't answer that question well, but hopefully I just gave some indication as to why I think it is difficult. We shouldn't blame the regulators necessarily because they are communicating, but it's a bigger issue.
Okay, we've got a question in the middle of the room.
Nariseti with News Corp. Two related questions on data.
Yes.
Deborah mentioned that audiences or consumers are asking questions about how their data is being increasingly used. Is there anything in this study that gives you a sense of what is it they're willing to exchange their data for? Do they want to get services? Do they want to get paid? I mean, what would it take for a consumer to say, okay, you can use my data? Is that awareness at that level? And as a lot of publishers are realizing the value of their audience data and are starting to kind of say, particularly News Corp, starting to say that our data itself is valuable in addition to your ability to reach our audience. Are you noticing a willingness on part of advertisers or big brands to pay a premium, not just for advertising, but also for the data that comes with that? Because currently they just get it for free.
Okay, right. Danger with two questions is, okay. So I'll answer the first one first, and you might have to repeat the second one when I get to it, right? Okay, what are consumers willing to pay? Okay, one, they know their data is powerful now, right? So they realize they have a bit of power. Who owns their data? Them, until they give it to someone else. So who are they gonna give it to and what for? Consumers are mercenary, right? They want something in return, and that is either access to, let's dissect it, content, right? Content to them is really valuable, right? So if they give an information to a content provider, what do they want in exchange? Free content, right? Maybe not free content forever, but at least they want, 20 hours of something, right? Or whatever. So that actually also indicates, because they are willing to give their information to content companies, that they truly value content, which I think is a really important point. The second thing that they expect, and in some markets more than others, is obviously, the discount vouchers, that type of the coupons or whatever. But that's nothing new. I mean, I've been filling out surveys in newspapers for years in return for a $1 donation to a charity, right? So it's not that this is new, but there is that return. And the third thing I think is just about, if I give you my data, you are going to give me something that is much more tailored to me, right? And is going to get rid of some of the clutter in my life, right? So if I give you my vital statistics, I'm a clothing company, I expect you to give me clothes that fit, right? Not give me, so I'm looking for an enhanced experience. So content, yes. Cash equivalents, yes. But also a better tailored experience in terms of how you deliver it to me. Get rid of the content, to get rid of the clutter in my life, and you've done me a favor. I'll give you my data. Obviously, if you betray that's a trust issue. If you betray that trust, I will not come back to you again. And that is where I think the flip side of all of this is data protection is really critical. But data protection isn't just physical, it's how you use it on an ongoing basis, which then tends to go to the second question, which of course now I've forgotten.
Will advertisers pay for that data? Will they pay the media owners for that data?
So I think advertisers, and again, Carlo can probably comment later, but I think advertisers are realizing that they need to access consumers in a completely different way. And therefore, if this working together, I mean, we talk a lot more about solutions, branded content, and all that good stuff. I believe that there is a premium that will be paid for that, because the content owner is much more able to deliver the consumer that the advertiser wants. The content that lies at the heart of that will still be a sort of function of good creative processes, but it's the fact that we know who these people are now, and we know what they really want. So I think that there is a premium for that. But I also think that it'll be, it's not just about space, right? We all know it's not just about selling space anymore. So I believe the answer is yes, but maybe that's a question that you can pick up in your panel.
Okay, do we have another question? We do.
Oh, wow, there's a microphone. My name's Colleen Fahey-Rush, and I'm from Viacom. A lot of people say, including me, that if you can't measure it, you can't monetize it.
Yeah.
And I think that I'd love to hear your point of view on the state of measurement today and how that could be a speed bump for some of your projections, or how we can resolve the limitations of some of the measurement, particularly here in the US.
What are the biggest limitations?
Yeah, well, we do talk about that in our insight piece because it is a critical limitation. That's a critical issue that needs to be addressed. I mean, advertisers are, in my opinion, increasingly platform agnostic, which means that if we don't get that information, we're, I was going to say something in the wind, but I can't say that word. So I think it is I mean, number one is we recognize it, everyone recognizes it, which means that, and I do believe we've made quite a lot of progress in the last year, 18 months. I mean, PwC has been very active, particularly in terms of on the print side, at trying to get cross-platform measurements around print. I think that around the world, probably it's even more shaky than it is here in the US. I think this is one of the areas where the US and the UK are definitely leading. And it's requiring a degree of collaboration we've never seen before. I think one of the problems is there's always this element of competition, which means no one is coming together to really discuss the issue. I think everyone in this room knows it's one of the hugest issues that we face, and that therefore there is unprecedented willingness to crack it. It's not cracked yet. Will it affect our data? I would say that actually in terms of our outlook, we haven't anticipated a huge change in that. And if there is, then arguably the projections would probably be more aggressive. So we acknowledge it, everyone in this room acknowledges it, there is progress. And again, maybe Carla, you'll also comment on it.
All right. Well, we have 5 minutes for everybody to reload with coffee, so I am going to cut off there. But thank you for your questions, and thank you, Marcel.
Thank you, Andrew.